There is a moment, a fraction of a second, no longer than a heartbeat, when a man with a gun decides whether to pull the trigger. Not the moment before, not the moment after. That exact sliver of time when the finger has already begun to move and the brain has not yet caught up with what the body is doing. Daniel Reeves had lived inside that fraction of a second more times than he could count. He had been trained for it, paid for it, sent across borders for it. He knew what it felt like from the other end of the barrel, the cold mechanical logic of it, the way everything else in the world goes quiet and small and irrelevant. But standing in the marble courtyard of the Al Rashid Royal Palace on a Tuesday morning in October, with a royal guard's face 2 inches from his own and a loaded weapon pressed against the man's jaw, Daniel Reeves felt something he had not felt in 11 years of fieldwork. He felt like he had made a catastrophic mistake. Not the gun, not the confrontation, not even being in that country at all. The mistake was older than that. Quieter. It had been building for 3 years inside a classified file that nobody in Langley wanted to open, and now it had arrived, fully assembled, fully armed, in the form of 47 soldiers emerging from the shadows of the palace perimeter with rifles raised. They came from the east gate, the west gate, from behind the fig trees lining the courtyard wall, from the roof, from everywhere. 47 guns, one man. And a secret that, if it walked out of that palace alive, would fracture the alliance between two governments and end the career of a man who had never once set foot on foreign soil. Here is what the official report would later say. There was an incident. It was resolved. No casualties. Here is what actually happened. Daniel Reeves was not supposed to be in that country at all. His orders, as they had been written and signed and passed down through 3 layers of bureaucratic insulation at Langley, were simple. He was to attend a bilateral security conference in Geneva, present a paper on counter-terrorism coordination frameworks, shake hands, drink bad coffee, come home. The kind of assignment they gave to field operatives who had been running too hard for too long and needed something quiet before they either burned out or broke something expensive. He had been running hard for 3 years. The assignment before Geneva had been 18 months in a safe house in Beirut, building a network of low-level informants in a city where every second person either worked for someone dangerous or was related to someone who did. Before that, a rotation through Eastern Europe that officially did not happen and practically speaking had also not happened, at least on paper. He had a name in the field. Not his real one, obviously. And that name had a reputation for being the kind of operative who finished what he started, which was a polite way of saying he stayed in dangerous places longer than people with functioning self-preservation instincts would. His handler at the time, a woman named Patricia Chen, who had been running field agents out of the Near East Division for 16 years and had the permanent expression of someone who had just smelled something bad, told him once that his problem was not courage. His problem was that he confused commitment with stubbornness and called both of them professionalism. He had not disagreed with her. He had also not changed. So when the Geneva conference was rerouted, not officially rerouted, nothing was ever officially anything in this business, but when the instruction arrived through a channel that technically did not exist asking him to make a detour, he made the detour. 3 days. That was what the instruction said. 3 days, in and out, collect a document from a source who would only hand it to someone he had met in person, and then Geneva. Then the bad coffee. Then home. The country was a kingdom. Medium-sized, oil-wealthy, sitting on a piece of geography that several major powers had competing and irreconcilable opinions about. It had a king who was old and sick, and had been old and sick for 2 years longer than anyone expected, and a prince who was young and ambitious and had been accumulating power in the way that young, ambitious men do, quietly at first, then not quietly at all, and then so openly that the quietness of the earlier phase felt in retrospect like a different person entirely. The CIA had a relationship with the kingdom, a long one, layered and complicated in the way that all such relationships are, built on mutual convenience and the shared understanding that convenience is not the same as trust. They shared intelligence on regional threats. They coordinated on certain operations that neither government was willing to acknowledge in writing. They had, over the decades, done each other favors that were not called favors and asked for things that were not called requests, and the whole arrangement functioned because everyone involved was sophisticated enough to understand what was actually happening while maintaining the public posture that nothing was. The source Daniel was going to meet was a man named Khalid. That was not his real name either. In the file he had been given, 3 pages, printed to be destroyed after reading, Khalid was described as a senior administrative official within the royal household, someone with access to the kind of internal communications that gave you a picture of what was actually being decided and by whom, as opposed to the official version. He had been providing information for 4 years. His motivation was described in the file as ideological, which was the word used when someone's motivation was complicated enough that putting a finer point on it created liability. The meeting was set for a hotel near the diplomatic quarter. Neutral ground. Public enough that a conversation between two men could not be characterized as anything other than two men having a conversation, but private enough that it would not be observed in any useful way. Daniel arrived the day before the meeting. He spent the evening doing what he always did the evening before a meeting: walking. Not the streets immediately around the hotel, but the wider area, the blocks that fanned out in each direction, the patterns of traffic and foot movement and the particular rhythms of a city going about its business. He was looking for nothing specific and everything in general, building the spatial memory that would tell him later, without having to consciously think about it, when something was wrong. Nothing was wrong. The city felt ordinary. It felt, if anything, slightly boring. A wealthy capital doing wealthy capital things. The kind of place where the violence, when it happened, was always a surprise because everything looked so deliberately, expensively, calm. He slept well. He always slept well before operations, which was another thing Patricia Chen had found notable about him. She said it meant either that he was psychologically well adapted for the work, or that something important in him had been switched off. She had never told him which one she thought it was. In the morning he dressed in civilian clothes, the particular kind of casual that takes effort, the kind that says businessman on a relaxed day rather than anything else, and went to the hotel lobby. He ordered coffee. He read a newspaper. He watched the room without appearing to watch the room, which is a skill that takes years to develop and, once developed, becomes as automatic as breathing. Khaled arrived 7 minutes late, which was within acceptable parameters. He was a small man, compact, with the particular kind of stillness that people develop when they have been carrying a secret for a long time. He sat down. They did not shake hands. Khalid ordered tea he did not drink. The conversation took 11 minutes. What Khalid told him in those 11 minutes was not what Daniel had been sent to hear. The document he was supposed to collect, a communication between two ministers regarding the coordination of certain financial flows that certain parties in Washington very much wanted to understand, that document existed. Khalid had it. He was prepared to hand it over. But first, he said, there was something Daniel needed to know, something that was not in any file, something that had been kept out of files deliberately by someone senior enough to keep things out of files, and that had been kept out for 3 years, which was approximately how long the situation it described had been developing. The prince, Khalid said, was not operating alone. He had a partner, a facilitator, someone on the other side of the relationship, the American side, who had been feeding him intelligence. Not the coordinated, officially sanctioned intelligence sharing that went through proper channels, private intelligence, the kind that gave a man an advantage over his rivals, the kind that, if it were known, would not be described as sharing. It would be described as betrayal. The name Khalid gave him was a name Daniel recognized. He recognized it because it was the name of a man who had been his supervisor for 18 months during the Eastern European rotation that officially had not happened. He sat with that for a moment, 2 moments. The tea on the table between them steamed and then stopped steaming. A woman across the lobby laughed at something on her phone. Outside, a car horn sounded once and then was silent. He asked Khalid how certain he was. Very certain, Khalid said. Certain enough to have written it down. The document Khalid handed him under the table, folded once, inside a newspaper, transferred in the way these things are transferred when two people have done it before and know how, was not the document Daniel had been sent to collect. It was something else entirely. 14 pages, printed in Arabic and English on alternate lines. Names, dates, transaction records, communication intercepts, the kind of document that does not get compiled unless someone spent a long time being very careful. Daniel took it. He did not change his expression. He finished his coffee. They sat for another 4 minutes, the length of time two businessmen might plausibly sit after conducting whatever ordinary business they had been conducting. Then they left separately, 3 minutes apart, as planned. He went back to his room. He read the 14 pages twice. Then he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall for a while. The problem with what he was holding was not that it was dangerous. Everything in this business was dangerous. The problem was that it was the specific kind of dangerous that did not have a clean procedural response. He could not simply cable Langley. The man named in those 14 pages had access to Langley communications. He could not simply pass it up the chain. The chain had a compromised link. He could not sit on it because Khalid had given it to him precisely because it needed to move, and move fast before someone figured out that Khalid had given it to anyone. He needed to get it to someone he trusted completely, through a channel that the man named in those 14 pages could not see. He had two such people. One was in Washington, one was in Paris. Neither of them could be reached through official channels without those channels being potentially visible. He used a method that was old enough and analog enough that it predated the digital infrastructure through which almost all communications now flowed, and that therefore existed in a gap that surveillance, however sophisticated, was not designed to cover. He sent a physical message through a courier who owed him a favor from a thing that had happened in a city he could not name to an address in Washington that was not an official address. Then he waited. The waiting was the part that went wrong. He was supposed to hear back within 24 hours. He heard nothing. He waited another 12 hours. Nothing. He tried a secondary contact method, one layer more exposed than the first. Nothing. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that while he was waiting in his hotel room with 14 pages of explosive documentation, the situation had already moved. Khalid had been identified, not as a source, not yet, but as someone who had been in contact with a foreign national in a hotel near the diplomatic quarter, which in this country, in this political climate, with a prince who had spent the last 2 years consolidating the internal security apparatus, was enough to trigger a process. The process was quiet at first, surveillance. Then, not quiet. On the morning of the third day, Daniel left his hotel to buy a newspaper from a stand 2 blocks away. A habit, a ritual, the kind of physical movement that gave his body something to do while his mind worked. And he noticed the car. Dark, unremarkable, parked at an angle that was slightly wrong. Not wrong enough for most people. Wrong enough for him. He bought the newspaper. He walked back to the hotel at the same pace he had left it. He went to his room. He packed what he could not leave behind and left what he could not take, which is a specific calculus that field operatives understand and civilians cannot quite imagine. The math of what your survival costs versus what your work costs versus what your exposure costs, and the answer is always slightly different and always slightly terrible. He needed to move. The question was where. The contact he had been trying to reach, the one in Washington who could not be reached through official channels, had a protocol for exactly this kind of situation. A fallback. A physical location in the city, a place that had been established years ago during a different operation and never decommissioned, because decommissioning required paperwork, and paperwork created records, and records were exactly what this kind of fallback was designed to avoid. The location was inside the diplomatic quarter. Getting there required passing through a checkpoint. At the checkpoint, there were 2 guards. They were not royal guards. They were municipal security, a distinction that mattered because municipal security in this country was, at this particular political moment, controlled by a ministry that was loyal to the king rather than to the prince. The distinction was subtle, but it was real, and Daniel was counting on it. He got through the checkpoint without incident. His cover documentation was good. It was always good. The documentation people at Langley were meticulous in ways that the rest of the organization was not always meticulous. And the guards were bored in the particular way of people who have been standing in the same place doing the same thing for a long time and have stopped really looking. He found the fallback location. It was a small office above a currency exchange, the kind of place that exists in diplomatic quarters all over the world, unremarkable by design. He went up the stairs. He knocked in the pattern. He waited. The door opened. The man inside was not who he expected. He had expected a contact, a local asset someone placed there for exactly this purpose. What he found instead was a man in his 50s with close-cropped grey hair and the kind of face that had been outdoors in difficult conditions for a long time. Weathered in a specific way, the kind you get not from sun and wind, but from sustained stress over years. The man was wearing civilian clothes that fit the way military clothes fit when someone used to wearing them puts on civilian clothes. Daniel did not recognize him, but he recognized the type. And the type recognized him back. They had a conversation that lasted 40 minutes and that Daniel would later describe in a debriefing that itself would be classified at a level he was not even certain had a name, as the most clarifying 40 minutes of his professional life. The man's name, his real one, which was unusual in this context and therefore significant, was Marcus Webb. He was retired. He had been retired for 14 months from a position that, he said, he would not name, but that Daniel would be able to infer. He was in the country privately. He had been in the country for 6 days. He had come because of the same name that was in Khalid's 14 pages, and because he had spent 14 months in retirement watching a situation develop that he had tried and failed to flag through official channels and had finally decided that unofficial channels were the only option left. He had been trying to reach the same contact in Washington, through the same fallback system, for 3 days. Neither of them had heard back, which meant the fallback was compromised, which meant the man in the 14 pages knew more than the 14 pages alone could account for, which meant the contamination went deeper than Khalid had documented. Daniel sat down. Marcus Webb sat across from him. Outside, the city continued doing its expensive, calm, ordinary things. They looked at each other with the particular expression of two people who have just understood that the situation they walked into is not the situation that was described to them, and that the difference between the two is the kind of difference that ends careers and sometimes ends other things. Daniel put the 14 pages on the table between them. Marcus Webb looked at them for a moment. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and put another set of documents on the table. Different format, different source, different time period. Same name, same transactions, deeper. The picture that the two sets of documents made together was not complicated. It was, in fact, very simple. Clean, even, in the way that very bad things are sometimes clean when you finally see them whole. Someone in Langley had been selling access to an ambitious prince. The prince had used that access to neutralize his rivals and secure his position. The king, who was old and sick, did not know. Several people in the American government who should have known did not know, because the man doing the selling was senior enough and careful enough to have kept it invisible. He had kept it invisible for 3 years. What ended the invisibility was Khalid. Khalid, who had spent 4 years building his own quiet documentation, his own careful record, and had chosen this moment, this specific window before the king died and the prince's position became unassailable, to hand it to someone who could use it. Daniel and Marcus Webb were that someone. Together, accidentally by the particular logic of two separate operations colliding in a small room above a currency exchange. The problem was getting what they were holding out of the country and into the right hands before the wrong hands understood what was in motion. The problem became more immediate 2 hours later when Daniel looked out the window of the currency exchange office and saw the car again, not the same car, a different one, but parked at the same wrong angle. And this time it was not municipal security. The plates were palace plates. They had perhaps an hour, maybe less. Marcus Webb looked at the plates. He looked at Daniel. He had the expression of a man doing very fast math on very bad numbers. Daniel thought about the 14 pages. He thought about what they were worth and what they would cost, and the specific calculation that you make when you are holding something that matters more than you do. He thought about Patricia Chen telling him that he confused commitment with stubbornness. Then he picked up his jacket and began to think about the palace. Not because going to the palace was a reasonable plan. It was by any rational measure the opposite of a reasonable plan. It was the kind of plan that only makes sense if you accept the premise that all the reasonable options have already been exhausted, and that what remains, however unreasonable, however dangerous, however much like the plot of something a serious person would dismiss, is not a choice, but a direction. The only direction still open. There was a person inside that palace who could end this cleanly. One person. Someone the prince trusted because he had no reason not to. Someone who did not yet know what was in those 14 pages. Someone who, if he knew, would act. Getting to that person required getting inside the palace. Getting inside the palace required a reason. Daniel had been building that reason in a general sense for the last 11 years. Now he needed it to be specific and fast and good enough to get him through a gate and into a marble courtyard and within speaking distance of a man who could change the outcome of everything. He had a cover identity with diplomatic adjacent credibility. He had documentation that could withstand a surface inspection. He had the kind of face that reads as authorized when it walks with the right posture. Not because of the face itself, but because of the 11 years of practice walking through doors that would have preferred to stay closed. He left Marcus Webb in the office with instructions and a backup plan that both of them understood was not really a plan, but a direction in which to run if everything else failed. He walked to the palace. He walked through the outer gate on credentials that were not fake exactly, but were not entirely what they appeared to be. He crossed the courtyard. He asked, in Arabic that was good enough, and in the manner of a man with a scheduled appointment, to be taken to the office of the man he needed to see. He was taken to an antechamber. He waited. A guard stood by the door. A second guard stood by a second door. Then the second door opened, and the wrong man walked through it. Not the man he had come to see. A man who looked at Daniel with the specific expression of someone who has been waiting for you to arrive, who has known you were coming since before you knew you were going, who has arranged the room and the moment and the outcome before you walked into any of them. The man smiled. He said Daniel's name, his real one. Daniel's hand moved before his mind did. It moved with 11 years of muscle memory and the fraction of a second logic that Patricia Chen had never been able to fully explain and that Daniel himself could not account for, except to say that the body learns some things that the brain is too slow to teach. His hand found his weapon. The weapon found the guard who had begun to move. The marble courtyard went very quiet. From somewhere above and behind and to every side, the sound of 47 safeties being released made a sound like one sound. 47 guns and one man, and a secret that had been 3 years in the building. The marble was cold under Daniel's feet, even through his shoes. He could feel it the way you feel temperatures when your body has flooded itself with something that makes every sensory signal louder than it should be. The cold of the floor, the heat of the afternoon sun cutting across the courtyard at a low angle, the weight of the weapon in his hand, which was both familiar and, in this specific configuration of circumstances, completely unlike anything it had ever felt before. The guard he was holding, a young man, 20s, the kind of physical build that takes serious investment to maintain, had gone very still. Not from fear exactly. From the calculation that serious training produces when a situation escalates past a certain threshold. The calculation that says, wait, assess, do not move unless you see the opening. The young man was waiting for the opening. The man who had walked through the door was not waiting for anything. His name was not something Daniel had been given. He stood at a comfortable distance, far enough that Daniel's reach could not close the gap, close enough that he could be heard without raising his voice. And he had the posture of someone who has been in rooms like this many times, and who regards the tension in them as a kind of weather, unpleasant but navigable. He said in English with an accent that placed him as Western-educated, probably British institutions followed by American ones, "It is better if you put that down." Daniel did not put it down. He said, "I want to see Faisal." The man tilted his head slightly. He said, "Faisal is unavailable." Which was information. Whether it was true information or strategic information was harder to determine, but it was information either way. Faisal al-Rashid was the king's younger brother, 63 years old, not a political figure in the conventional sense. He held a ceremonial role, sat on several oversight councils, attended the functions that royalty attends. But he had something that most of the people around him did not have, which was the trust of his brother the king, earned over 6 decades of proximity, and the reputation, known in intelligence circles, because reputations travel even when the people they describe do not, for being the one member of the royal family who treated the difference between what was right and what was convenient as an actual distinction rather than a flexible concept. Daniel had built his entire plan, such as it was, assembled in 40 minutes above a currency exchange with borrowed documents and a retired officer he had met an hour earlier. Around getting those 14 pages in front of Faisal al-Rashid before the prince's people understood what was happening. The man at the door was the prince's people. The 47 soldiers were the prince's people. The fact that they were inside the palace, on the grounds of a building that was supposed to be the king's home and the king's security, told Daniel something that Khalid's 14 pages had documented in theory, but that he was now seeing in practice, and the gap between theory and practice was large enough to be frightening. The prince had already moved, not all the way. Not the final move, but far enough that his people were inside the perimeter, far enough that the wrong man walked through the wrong door at exactly the right moment to intercept Daniel, far enough that the window Khalid had described, the window before the king died and the position became unassailable, was closing. Maybe already closed. Daniel held the weapon steady. The guard held still. The man at the door watched with the patience of someone who has agreed to wait because waiting costs him nothing. In his left jacket pocket, folded in the way that Khalid had folded the original, were the 14 pages, and beneath them, the documents Marcus Webb had added. Together they were a weight that was not physical but registered physically, the way important things sometimes do. A pressure against the ribs, a specific gravity. He said, "The king." A pause. Brief. The man said, "The king is resting." Daniel said, "The king needs to stop resting." He watched the man's face. Watched for the micro-expression that would tell him whether that was a bluff he could push against or a wall he was not going to get through. The man's face gave him almost nothing, which was itself information. Practice blankness is not the same as calm. It takes work to maintain, and the work shows if you know where to look. There was a door to Daniel's left. Not the door he had entered through, a different one, set into the wall in the way that service corridors are set into walls in large official buildings, present but not emphasized, the architecture of people moving through spaces without being seen moving through them. He had noted it when he entered. He noted it now. The 47 soldiers had not fully closed the ring. They had assembled with impressive speed, but they were deployed for containment, which meant their orientation was toward him, toward the center of the courtyard. The door to his left was behind the nearest cluster of them. Not an escape route. An impossibility dressed up as an option, but not all of them were looking at the door. He did something that was not in any protocol he had been trained on and that Patricia Chen would have described later as either inspired or the behavior of a man who had decided to stop calculating and start committing, which she would have meant as a criticism, even though it was also, in a specific narrow sense, accurate. He released the guard, not dramatically, deliberately. He stepped back, one pace, and removed the weapon from the guard's jaw and held it at his side at an angle that was not threatening and was not surrendering, and he looked at the man in the doorway and said, "I need 4 minutes with Faisal, that's all. 4 minutes and I walk out of here and this ends." The guard, released, stepped to the side. His hand went to his own weapon, but he did not draw. He was waiting. Still calculating. The man in the doorway said nothing for a long moment. He was assessing. Looking at Daniel the way you look at something when you are trying to decide which category it belongs in. Threat to be neutralized. Asset to be used. Problem to be managed. Daniel said, "There are 14 pages in my left jacket pocket. I'm going to take them out slowly and hold them up. When you see what they are, you are going to want to make a phone call. I want you to make that call to Faisal and not to the prince." The man said, "Why would I do that?" Daniel said, "Because the phone call to the prince is the one that ends your career in about 18 months when this comes apart. The call to Faisal is the one where you were the person who caught it." The courtyard was very quiet. 47 men and a cold marble floor, and an afternoon sun cutting low, and the sound of a city outside the palace walls doing its ordinary expensive things. The man looked at him. The look was long and it was complicated, and it was the look of someone doing very fast math on the question of whether the man standing in front of them with a lowered weapon and a document in his pocket is telling the truth, and what the cost is of each answer. Daniel waited. He was good at waiting. Patricia Chen had said once that his patience was the one thing about him that could not be faked, which she had meant as a compliment and which he had taken as one. The man said, "Show me." Daniel reached into his jacket pocket slowly, with 2 fingers. The way you reach for things when you are in rooms full of armed people. He withdrew the folded pages. He held them up. The man crossed the courtyard. He took the pages. He read the first 2. Not scanning, reading. His expression did not change. The practiced blankness held, but something around his eyes shifted by a quantity that was very small and very informative. He folded the pages. He did not give them back. He looked at Daniel for a moment. Then he made a phone call. The call was in Arabic, which Daniel's Arabic was good enough to follow. It was short. The man gave a name, not Faisal's. An intermediary. The kind of call you make when you want something to happen without your fingerprints being the only ones on the decision. He said that there was a foreign national in the eastern courtyard with information that required immediate senior review. He used a specific phrase that Daniel recognized as a code phrase from a briefing he had received years ago about internal royal communication protocols. A phrase that signaled urgency and also signaled that the matter was one the king himself would want to be made aware of. He ended the call. He looked at the 47 soldiers. He made a gesture. They did not lower their weapons, but they stepped back, 1 pace each. The ring expanded. The man looked at Daniel. He said, 8 minutes. Daniel said, I said 4. The man said, I said 8. They waited. The door in the wall to Daniel's left opened. Not the service door, the main door through which the man had entered. It opened from the inside, and the man who came through it was not Faisal al-Rashid. He was older than Faisal, heavier. He moved with the deliberate economy of someone who has been in pain for a long time and has organized their movements around the management of that pain. He was wearing clothes that were not formal, loose fabric, the kind of garment that accommodates discomfort. And he had the face of someone who has been sleeping and woken, or who has not been sleeping at all, and it shows. The king looked at Daniel Reeves with the expression of a man who has lived long enough that surprise is no longer a sensation he experiences in the same way other people do. He looked at him with something more like recognition, though they had never met, as if the presence of a man in his courtyard under these particular circumstances was something he had been expecting, abstractly, for a long time. Daniel held the remaining pages carefully. The king looked at the man who had made the phone call. A look passed between them that was the compressed version of a conversation. Authority and information, and some form of confirmation, all in a look that lasted less than 3 seconds. The man handed the king the first 2 pages. The king read them. He read them standing in his courtyard with 47 soldiers arranged at a distance and a CIA operative in the middle, and the afternoon sun going orange at the edges, and he read them the way old men read terrible news, without visible devastation, with the particular stillness of someone who has been carrying the possibility of something like this for a long time and is now simply being told that the possibility has become fact. He looked up from the pages. He said something in Arabic that Daniel's translation brain processed as, "How long?" Daniel said, 3 years that we can document. Probably longer. The king looked at the pages again. He looked at Daniel. He was assessing, but differently from the way the man in the doorway had assessed, not calculating advantage, not managing risk, but the older and more fundamental assessment of deciding whether the person in front of him could be believed. Daniel said, "There are more pages, and there is a second source with independent documentation." The king said, "Where?" Daniel said, "Safe, for now." The king was quiet for a moment. Then he said something to the man who had made the phone call. An instruction. The man nodded and moved toward a different door. The king looked at the soldiers. He spoke briefly, clearly, without raising his voice. They lowered their weapons, not all at once. One by one, as the instruction processed, the barrels came down. The ring held, but the orientation changed. Still a perimeter, but no longer aimed. The king looked at Daniel one more time. He said, "Come inside." He said it the way a man who has been king for 31 years says things, not as a request and not exactly as a command, but as the statement of an outcome that has been decided. Daniel was going to come inside. The nature of the invitation made the alternative irrelevant. Daniel followed him through the door. Inside the palace, the temperature dropped. Air conditioning of a specific quality, the kind that large stone-built official spaces produce, not cold exactly, but a removal of heat that feels like entering a different atmosphere. The ceilings were high, the floors were the same marble as the courtyard, and his footsteps sounded different in here, more contained, absorbed by the walls. They went through a corridor and into a room that was not a formal room, a sitting room of some kind. Chairs arranged around a low table. Books on a shelf, a mixture of Arabic and English and French titles, the accumulation of a reading life. On the table, a glass of water. The glass was half empty and had been there for a while. The king sat, Daniel sat. The man who had made the phone call stood at the door. The king said, "Tell me." Daniel told him. He told him in the compact, structured way that operatives learn to tell things, facts first, then context, then implication. What the documents contained, what the timeline was, who the name in the documents was, what had been given and what had been received, and for how long, and to what effect. He did not editorialize. He did not explain what the king should feel about it. He provided the information and let the information do what information does. The king listened. He did not interrupt. He looked at the table in front of him while Daniel talked, with the exception of 2 moments where he looked up. Once when Daniel named the specific intelligence that had been shared, once when Daniel told him what it had been used for. Both times he looked up briefly and then back down, and his face did not change. When Daniel finished, the king said, I was documentation." Daniel gave him the pages. The king read them slowly, all of them. He took his time. The room was quiet except for the sound of pages turning and the distant sounds of the palace, footsteps somewhere, a door closing, the ordinary sounds of a large building doing what large buildings do. When he finished, he set the pages on the table. He picked up the glass of water. He looked at it. He put it down without drinking. He said, "You came here alone." Daniel said, "Yes." The king said, "That was not wise." Daniel said, "No, it wasn't." The king almost smiled. It was a very small movement. He said, "But you are here." Daniel said, "I am here." Another silence. In the corridor outside the room, footsteps approached and then stopped. The man at the door spoke briefly to someone Daniel could not see. The footsteps withdrew. The king said, "My brother will come in a few minutes. He will want to ask you questions. You should answer them the way you answered mine." Daniel said, "I will." The king said, "And the second source, the man you mentioned." Daniel said, "He is in a safe location. I need to communicate with him." The king looked at the man at the door. He said something brief. The man stepped out. The king looked back at Daniel. He said, "In my experience, information like this creates a very specific problem. The people who have it want to use it. The people it is about want to suppress it. And the people in the middle, the people who are supposed to make decisions based on it, are usually the last ones to receive it." Daniel said, "That is my experience also." The king said, "You were supposed to be in Geneva." Daniel looked at him. He said, "You know about Geneva." The king said, I know many things about what your agency does, Mr. Reeves. Some of it they tell me, some of it I learn on my own. It is one of the administrative complications of a 50-year relationship. He said Daniel's name, his real name, not the cover, the real one. Daniel understood several things at once. He understood that the king had known who was in his courtyard before he walked through the door. He understood that the 8-minute wait had not been about getting Faisal, it had been about something else, some verification or confirmation that the king had needed before he came out himself. He understood that the situation was both better and more complicated than he had been calculating. Better because the king was not surprised, not by Daniel, not by the presence of American intelligence in his palace. The relationship was 50 years old, and 50 years of relationship means that a man stops being surprised by the shapes it takes. More complicated, because if the king had known who was in the courtyard and had still come out, it meant the king had wanted to come out. Had wanted to have this conversation. Had been, in some way that Daniel could not yet fully see, waiting for this specific conversation, or something very much like it. The door opened. Faisal al-Rashid came in. He was smaller than his brother and younger by 7 years, and he moved without the managed pain that the king moved with. He looked at Daniel the way his brother had not looked at him. Directly, immediately, with the frank appraisal of someone who was making a decision while they crossed the room. He sat. He looked at the pages on the table. He looked at his brother. He said in Arabic, which Daniel followed, "Is it confirmed?" The king said, "Sufficiently." Faisal picked up the pages. He read faster than the king had. Not skimming. He was a fast reader, the way some people are, absorbing information in large blocks rather than line by line. He put the pages down. He looked at Daniel. He said in English, "How did Khalid get this documentation?" Daniel said, 4 years of careful observation and very good memory. Faisal said, "Is Khalid safe?" Daniel said, "I don't know." Faisal and the king exchanged a look. Faisal said, "Where is he now?" Daniel said, "I don't know. We separated before I came here and I have not been able to communicate since." Faisal said, "That concerns me." Daniel said, "It concerns me also." The room held the weight of what was not being said. Khalid's safety was one thread. Marcus Webb, in the office above the currency exchange, was another. The man named in the 14 pages in Washington, who did not yet know that his name was on a table in a palace in a city he had never visited, he was a third thread, all of them pulling in different directions, all of them connected. Faisal looked at his brother. He said something brief in Arabic that Daniel translated as, "We have perhaps a few hours before this surface." The king nodded. Faisal looked at Daniel. He said, "What do you need?" Daniel said, "I need a secure channel to one person in Washington, not official." "The official channels are the problem." Faisal said, "I understand that." He stood. He went to the door and spoke to the man outside. He came back and sat. He said, 15 minutes. He looked at Daniel the way his brother had looked at him, assessing, but with something underneath the assessment. Something that was not warmth exactly, but was the thing adjacent to warmth that you develop when you have been doing difficult and important work for a long time and you recognize, across a table, someone else who has been doing the same. He said, "You walked into a palace full of armed soldiers because you thought it was the only way to get this document to someone who would act on it." Daniel said, "Yes." Faisal said, "And if my brother had not come out?" Daniel said, "Then I would have had a very different conversation with your guards." Faisal said, "That is a very diplomatic answer." Daniel said, "I've been practicing." Faisal almost smiled. The almost smile was identical in character to the almost smile the king had produced 10 minutes earlier. Genetics expressing themselves in the particular shape of a not-quite smile. Faisal said, "You understand that what is in these pages is not only about your agency. What happens inside my family, inside this government, is also in these pages." Daniel said, "I understand that." Faisal said, "And you understand that how this information moves, and to whom and in what sequence, that is not something that can be decided entirely by your side." Daniel said, "I understand that also, which is why I am in this room instead of trying to move it any other way." Faisal looked at him for a long moment. He picked up the pages again. He looked at a specific entry. Daniel could not see which one from where he was sitting, but he watched Faisal's eyes stop on a line and stay there for a moment longer than the others. He set them down. He said, "My brother is dying." Daniel said nothing. Faisal said, "Not quickly, but certainly. He has perhaps 4 months, perhaps 6. The doctors disagree on the pace but not on the direction."